The eviction was not a grand, dramatic affair. There was no shouting, no slamming of doors that echoed through the valley. It was a quiet, bloodless thing, conducted in the thin light of a November afternoon with the politeness of a business transaction. Alara's father, a man whose spine had been replaced with rigid principle years ago, simply handed her a small canvas bag containing a few loaves of bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and the 10 silver dollars that constituted her entire inheritance. He did not meet her eyes. Her transgression was not one of theft or violence, but of refusal, a quiet, unshakable refusal to bind her life to a man twice her age for the sake of consolidating 2 adjacent parcels of tired farmland. This refusal was, in her father's world, a greater sin than any other, for it was a disruption of order. And so, with the chilling finality of a closing ledger, she was excised from that order. She stood on the dirt track that led away from the only home she had ever known, the wind finding the gaps in her worn wool coat, and watched the door close. It made a simple, hollow sound, a full stop. She walked until the familiar shapes of the farmstead sank behind the rolling, dun-colored hills. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy and seamless, promising a winter that would be long and unforgiving. The land itself seemed to be bracing for the onslaught, the trees stripped to skeletal branches, the grasses bleached to the color of bone. There was a bite in the wind, a dry, sharp cold that spoke not of invigorating frost, but of a deep, enduring chill that would settle into the marrow of the earth and stay there for months. Alara felt a kinship with the landscape. She, too, felt stripped down to her essential self, a core of stubborn life encased in a shell of vulnerability. The 10 silver dollars felt heavy and useless in her pocket, a mockery of true value in a world where warmth and shelter were the only currencies that mattered. She had no destination. To go east was to head toward the more prosperous towns, where she would be seen as nothing more than a vagrant. To go west was to venture into the unsettled territories, a prospect for which she was hopelessly unprepared. Her world had shrunk to the space she occupied, the cold air she breathed, and the dwindling daylight. She remembered then a story her grandmother used to tell, a fragment of family lore that was mostly dismissed as sentimental nonsense. It concerned a small, strangely shaped piece of land, a sliver running alongside the old, dry bed of the Serpent River. It had belonged to a great-great-aunt who had been something of a recluse, a woman who, according to the tales, preferred the company of rocks and water to people. The deed had passed down through the generations, an administrative footnote nobody ever bothered to expunge, because the land itself was considered utterly worthless. It was a steep, eroded bank of clay and stone, unfit for grazing, impossible to plow, and possessing no timber worth felling. It was, her father had once declared with a sneer, a deed to a ditch. But it was hers. The knowledge sat in her mind, a small, cold stone of fact. It was the only thing in the entire world, aside from the clothes on her back and the coins in her pocket, that she could claim as her own. Finding it took the better part of 2 days. She followed the ghost of the Serpent River, a meandering depression in the earth filled with pale, smooth stones and the husks of last summer's weeds. The town of Haven's Rest sat a few miles distant, a cluster of wooden buildings puffing smoke into the gray sky, looking like a stubborn outpost against the vast, indifferent wilderness. The people there were much like her own family, practical, hard-working, and deeply suspicious of anything that did not conform to the established patterns of life. She knew she would find no welcome there. Finally, she saw it. The riverbank rose sharply on one side of the dry bed, a crumbling wall of earth 20 feet high in places, scarred by wind and ancient water. It was exactly as described, a monument to uselessness. Gnarled roots of long-dead trees clawed at the air from the cliff face, and the soil was a miserable mix of dense gray clay and sharp-edged shale. A few hardy skeletal bushes clung to its surface, their branches rattling in the wind like dice in a cup. It was a place of profound neglect, a landscape that had been forgotten by both man and nature. Alara stood before it, the canvas bag lighter now, the cold a more insistent companion. She felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled her knees. This was her inheritance, this vertical slice of barren dirt. It was a cruel joke, a final testament to her worth in the eyes of her family and the world. She could die here, and the wind would scour her bones clean, and no one would even know to look for her in such a forsaken place. She slid down the gravelly side of the riverbed and huddled against the base of the bank, trying to find some small respite from the incessant wind. She pulled her coat tighter, her body aching with a fatigue that was more than physical. It was the weariness of a soul that had been cast out. As she sat there, shivering, her hand pressed against the cold ground, she noticed something, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the quality of the cold. Where the wind could not reach, in the deep crevices and under the overhangs of the bank, the earth itself felt different. It was not warm, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it lacked the vicious, biting chill of the air. It was a neutral cold, a stable cold. It was the cold of a deep cellar, not the cold of an open grave. The memory of her grandmother's voice came back to her, not as a coherent story, but as disconnected phrases. The earth has a long memory for sunlight. Deep enough, the winter never arrives. Animals know, they go to ground. Her grandmother had been a woman who paid attention to the small, quiet truths of the world, truths that were easily shouted down by the louder, more practical concerns of farming and commerce. Alara pressed her cheek against the packed clay of the bank, closing her eyes. She ignored the grit and the dampness, focusing only on that faint, residual coolness that was not, in fact, cold. It was the absence of the wind's assault. It was stillness. And in that stillness, a thought, fragile and audacious, began to form. It was a desperate, nonsensical idea, the kind of notion that could only be born from having absolutely no other options. People built their houses up into the wind and the weather, fighting the elements with timber and stone. They built fires that consumed cords of wood, battling the cold with brute force. What if they were wrong? What if the answer was not to build up, but to dig in? The thought was so contrary to everything she had ever known that she almost dismissed it as a symptom of hunger and exhaustion. Houses were structures of pride, visible statements of prosperity and permanence. To live in a hole in the ground was the domain of burrowing animals, of the destitute and the feral. It was an admission of utter defeat. Yet the idea persisted, stubborn and insistent. The bank was her land. It was worthless for farming, but it was a massive wall of earth, a thermal battery that had been soaking in the warmth of the summer sun for months. While the surface froze and thawed with the passing days and nights, the deep earth remained constant. Her plan, as it began to take shape, was one of profound simplicity and immense labor. She would not build a house. She would excavate one. She would carve a space for herself inside the forgotten land, creating a shelter that worked with the quiet laws of nature rather than fighting a losing battle against them. She would go to ground. The first task was to acquire a proper tool. The small trowel from her mother's garden she'd tucked into her bag was pitifully inadequate for the task ahead. She spent one of her precious silver dollars in Haven's Rest, a transaction that drew suspicious and pitying glances from the proprietor of the general store, Mr. Abernathy. He was a man whose authority in the town was as solid and unyielding as the granite foundation of his shop. He had a fleshy, disapproving face and small eyes that seemed to be constantly taking inventory of the world's shortcomings. "Just the shovel head?" he asked. his voice a low rumble of skepticism. A full shovel with a sturdy hickory handle was $3. The head alone, a cast-off from a broken tool, was $1. Just the head, Alara confirmed, her voice quiet but firm. She could find her own handle. She had to. "And what's a slip of a girl like you planning on digging with that?" he pressed, not out of genuine curiosity, but as a way of asserting his place in the social order. He was the established merchant. She was the transient, the unknown quantity, the potential problem. "A garden," she lied, the word feeling foreign and absurd on her tongue. Abernathy grunted, a sound of disbelief. "Bit late in the year for planting. The ground will be hard as iron in a fortnight." He slid the heavy piece of metal across the counter. "Your funeral." She found a suitable branch of seasoned ironwood by the riverbed and spent the better part of the day shaping it with her knife, wedging it into the shovel head, and securing it with strips of leather cut from the hem of her underskirt. The result was a crude but functional tool, heavy and unbalanced but solid. It felt like an extension of her own desperate will. That evening, she chose her spot, a place where a small landslide had created a natural alcove, providing some initial shelter. She drew a rough rectangle in the dirt, the proposed dimensions of her single room, and with the sun setting, she plunged the shovel into the earth. The sound was a dull thud, a commitment made. The work was brutal, a torment of muscle and bone. The topsoil was thin, quickly giving way to a dense, unforgiving layer of clay mixed with shale. Each shovelful was a battle. The shale fragments were sharp and numerous, turning the digging into a slow, painful process of prying and scraping. Her hands, accustomed to mending and kitchen work, were raw by the end of the first day. By the third, they were a mess of broken blisters and deep, bleeding cuts. She tore more strips from her clothing to wrap them, but the rough handle of the makeshift shovel still managed to find new ways to torment her flesh. Her back screamed in protest, a constant fiery ache that settled deep in her spine. Every morning she woke from a shallow, shivering sleep, her body so stiff she could barely move. The cold was her constant adversary. It seeped into her bones while she slept and numbed her fingers while she worked. She measured her progress not in feet, but in inches. The pile of excavated earth grew with agonizing slowness beside her burgeoning cavern. The townspeople, what few of them ventured this far out, began to notice. At first they were merely curious. A woman digging alone in a worthless piece of land was a novelty. Children would sometimes watch from a distance, whispering and pointing. Soon the novelty curdled into suspicion and ridicule. The story of the strange woman on the Serpent Riverbank spread through Haven's Rest. They called her the Mole Woman. The name was whispered over fences and in the pews on Sunday. It was a label that neatly categorized and dismissed her, turning her struggle into a cautionary tale about what happens to a woman without a man or a family to guide her. She was not just eccentric, she was mad, a creature who had rejected human society for a life of dirt and darkness. Alara was aware of the talk. She felt the eyes on her when she made her weekly, necessary trips into town for supplies. Her $10 were dwindling, spent on flour, salt, dried beans, and oil for her small lamp. Each transaction was a fresh humiliation. The pitying looks were almost worse than the scorn. They saw a fallen woman, a charity case in the making. They could not comprehend that the hole she was digging was an act of creation, not of destruction. It was an act of defiance, a declaration that she would not simply lie down and be erased by the world. She would carve her own space, however crude and unconventional. One afternoon, a man approached her. He was tall and weathered, with the slow, deliberate movements of a farmer. He introduced himself as Silas, the owner of the land on the opposite side of the riverbed. He did not mock her. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a kind of weary curiosity. "That's a powerful lot of digging," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. He gestured with his chin toward the growing mound of clay and rock. "You mean to bury treasure or dig it up?" "I'm building a house," Alara replied, not stopping her work. The rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel was the only answer she had to the world's skepticism. Silas watched her for a long moment, his brow furrowed. He looked at the shallow, ragged hole she had managed to carve out, then up at the vast, uncaring sky. "A house," he repeated, the word hanging in the cold air. He shook his head, a gesture of slow, profound disbelief. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's not a house. That's a grave." He was not being cruel, he was being practical. He was speaking the truth as he understood it. "The earth is warmer than the air," she said, her voice tight with effort, as she pried a large piece of shale loose. "The wind doesn't blow 6 feet down." Silas considered this. He was a man who understood the earth, but he understood it in terms of what it could yield from its surface. Crops, pasture, timber. The idea of living inside it was alien. "Maybe so," he allowed, "but the damp will get in your bones. And the winter here, the winter will freeze the ground solid 4 feet down. This hole of yours will be an icebox." She did not argue with him. She had no breath for it, and no evidence to offer beyond her own desperate conviction. He watched her for a while longer, then left as quietly as he had arrived. But he returned a few days later. He said nothing, simply left an old, discarded pickaxe with a cracked handle near her worksite. It was a small gesture, but to Alara it was monumental. It was not an endorsement of her plan, but it was an acknowledgement of her labor. It was a sign that at least one person saw her, not as a madwoman, but as a human being engaged in a desperate struggle. The pickaxe changed everything. It allowed her to break up the compacted clay and shatter the layers of shale that had resisted her shovel. Her progress quickened. The hole deepened, becoming a proper cavern. The walls began to rise around her as she dug further into the bank. It was a strange, inverse construction. She was not adding, but subtracting. She was revealing the space that was already there, hidden within the earth. She learned the language of the soil. She could read the layers of sediment like pages in a book, telling the story of ancient floods and long droughts. She found a thick, dense vein of gray clay that was perfect for plastering the rougher sections of the walls, making them smoother and more stable. As the days shortened and the cold deepened, her dugout took shape. It was a single room, roughly 10 feet by 12. The ceiling was low, just high enough for her to stand upright in the center. She had left a thick pillar of earth in the middle for support, a technique she had seen used in root cellars. The most difficult part was the entrance. She built a framework of scavenged lumber and stones, creating a short, descending passageway that would act as a cold trap, preventing the winter winds from blowing directly into her living space. For a door, she wove a thick, heavy mat of river reeds and branches, reinforcing it with mud and canvas from her pack. It was crude, but it was a barrier between her world and the one outside. Her greatest challenge was creating a chimney. A fire was essential for cooking and for providing a dry, radiant heat to combat the natural dampness of the earth. To live underground without a proper flue for the smoke was a death sentence. She spent days carefully carving a narrow shaft upward through the dense clay, using a long pole with a sharpened bit of metal tied to the end. It was terrifying work. A collapse could bring tons of earth down on her. She worked slowly, methodically, shoring up the shaft with flat stones as she went. When she finally broke through the surface, seeing that small circle of gray sky from the floor of her dwelling, she wept with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She lined the opening with more stones to create a small, functional chimney pot, just high enough to clear the expected snowdrifts. By the time the first snow flurries began to drift down from the pewter sky, Her home was complete. From the outside, it was almost invisible. There was only the low mound of the entrance, the stubby stone chimney, and the large pile of excavated earth, now dusted with white. It looked less like a dwelling and more like an animal's den. But inside, it was a sanctuary. She built a small, efficient hearth of stone and clay directly beneath the chimney flue. A fire, fed with dry wood she had painstakingly gathered for weeks, burned with a steady, smokeless heat. The thick earthen walls absorbed and radiated the warmth, creating a stable, comfortable temperature. The air was still and quiet, the howling of the wind a distant, muffled whisper. She had a rough-hewn bed frame built into the wall, a small table, and shelves carved directly out of the clay. It was a troglodyte's palace, a kingdom of earth and fire. Mr. Abernathy paid her a visit. He did not come alone. He was accompanied by the town constable, a man whose primary role was to enforce the unwritten rules of social conformity. They stood at the entrance to her dugout, their tall frames silhouetted against the bleak winter sky. Abernathy's face was a mask of grim disapproval. "This is an outrage," he declared, his voice booming in the quiet air. "You cannot live like this. It is unsanitary. It is improper. You are a blight on this community, woman." "I am on my own land," Ilara said, her voice calm. She stood in the entrance of her home, the gentle warmth from within wrapping around her like a shawl. She was not cold. For the first time in months, she was not cold. "This is not living, it is burrowing," the constable added, looking at the structure with disgust. "We have ordinances against vagrancy. We could have you removed." "I am not a vagrant. I have a home," she stated simply. The truth of the statement resonated within her. This hole in the ground was more of a home than her father's cold, drafty farmhouse had ever been. Abernathy sneered. "A home? That is a mud hole, a den for a wild animal. When the deep freeze comes, you will either suffocate or freeze in that tomb you have built. We are offering you a place at the poorhouse. It is a Christian duty." The offer was an ultimatum, an assertion of his power and her helplessness. To accept would be to admit defeat, to concede that her mad plan had failed. "I thank you for your concern," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument, "but I will be fine." They left, muttering about her stubbornness and her madness. Their visit was meant to intimidate her, but it had the opposite effect. It solidified her resolve. Their world of rigid rules and cold charity was the very thing from which she had sought refuge. Her dugout was not just a shelter, it was a fortress against that world. She would not be driven from it. The winter arrived in earnest a week later. It did not creep in, it descended like a hammer blow. The temperature plummeted and the sky opened up, releasing a blizzard of terrifying force. It was a storm that would be spoken of for generations, the great white hurricane of that year. The wind shrieked like a banshee, a solid wall of sound and fury that tore at the town of Haven's Rest. Snow fell not in flakes but in blinding horizontal sheets, driven by the gale. It buried fences, piled in drifts that reached the eaves of houses, and made travel utterly impossible. The world was reduced to a maelstrom of white chaos. Inside her dugout, Ilara was dimly aware of the storm's fury. The wind's scream was a muted, distant hum, the sound of a giant sleeping uneasily far above her. There were no drafts, no rattling windows, no groaning timbers. The thick, silent earth absorbed the storm's rage, leaving her in a pocket of profound peace. Her small fire crackled merrily in the hearth, its warmth held and radiated by the clay walls. A pot of bean soup bubbled on the embers, filling the small space with a savory, comforting aroma. She had light from her oil lamp, a stack of firewood that would last for weeks, and a sense of security that was absolute. The storm was not her enemy. It was an irrelevant tantrum happening in another world. She sat on her simple bed, mending a tear in her coat, and listened to the quiet. In Haven's Rest, it was a different story. The houses, built to stand proud against the sky, were now fighting a losing war with the cold. The wind forced its way through every crack and crevice, a relentless, life-sapping force. Frost formed on the inside of window panes, then crept across the floors. Families huddled together in a single room, stuffing rags into the gaps around doors and windows, burning through their woodpiles at an alarming rate. The cold was a physical presence, an intruder that could not be repelled. Mr. Abernathy's well-built store, with its large glass windows, became an ice palace. He and his family shivered in the back rooms, wrapped in every blanket they owned, the sound of the wind mocking their prosperity. For Silas, the storm was a personal assault. His farmhouse, a sturdy structure that had weathered 50 winters, seemed to shrink and tremble before the blizzard's onslaught. The wind found a way to lift the shingles on the roof, creating a terrifying rattle that spoke of imminent failure. Snow forced its way under the door, creating a growing drift in his front room. His wife and 2 small children were huddled by the hearth, but the fire seemed to produce more smoke than heat, its warmth stolen by the drafts that sliced through the room. His woodpile, foolishly left uncovered, was buried under a 6-foot drift. He was now burning fence posts, the seasoned wood of his own boundaries, to keep his family from freezing. On the second day of the storm, his fear for his family morphed into a strange, nagging worry for the woman in the riverbank. The mole woman. He had seen her as a fool, an object of pity. He had predicted she would freeze in her grave. Now, as his own solid, respectable house failed him, he could not shake the image of her, digging alone with a desperate, focused intensity. He thought of her quiet statement, "The wind doesn't blow 6 feet down." It had sounded like madness then. Now it sounded like wisdom. By the 3rd day, the situation in his own home was critical. The last of the fence posts were gone, and he was contemplating breaking up the kitchen chairs. The temperature in the room was well below freezing. His youngest child had a racking cough, and his wife's face was pale and drawn with fear. He made a decision. It was a desperate gamble, a fool's errand, but he had to know, he had to see. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he possessed, tied a rope from the back door to the barn so he would not get lost in the whiteout, and then set out, leaning into the wind, toward the Serpent River. The journey of a few hundred yards was an Arctic expedition, a battle for every step. The wind was a physical force that knocked him off his feet twice. The snow was so deep it was like wading through molasses. He could not see more than 3 feet in front of him. He navigated by instinct, by the memory of the land's contours, beneath the crushing weight of the snow. He was half frozen and utterly exhausted when he stumbled into the relative shelter of the dry riverbed. He almost missed it. The entrance to Alara's dugout was all but invisible, a gentle depression in a massive drift. The only sign was the small stone chimney, poking just a few inches above the snow, a thin, almost imperceptible plume of gray smoke rising from it. The smoke did not whip away in the gale. It seemed to be pulled straight up, as if from a place the wind could not touch. He clawed his way through the snow to the entrance and banged on the woven door. His fist felt like a club, his knuckles numb and useless. For a moment there was no response, and a terrible fear seized him. Had he been wrong? Had she perished in there after all, a victim of her own folly? He was about to turn away when the doormat was pulled inward. Alara stood there, silhouetted against a soft, warm light. She was wearing a simple dress, her sleeves rolled up. Her face was calm, her hair slightly damp from the steam of her cooking pot. The air that flowed out of the opening was a miracle. It was warm. It was still. It smelled of wood smoke and soup. Silas stared, unable to speak. He was covered in snow, his beard caked with ice, his body shaking uncontrollably with cold. He looked like a creature from the heart of the storm. She looked like she was in the heart of a peaceful summer afternoon. "Silas?" she asked, her voice filled with a quiet concern that held no trace of triumph or surprise. He could only nod, the effort immense. She stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. He stumbled down the short passageway and into the room. The transition was staggering. He moved from a world of shrieking chaos and lethal cold into a pocket of absolute tranquility and life-sustaining warmth. The difference was so profound it felt like stepping through a portal into another reality. The small room was bathed in the gentle flicker of the fire and the steady glow of the lamp. The air was warm on his frozen cheeks, a sensation so welcome it was almost painful. He saw her simple, orderly home. The bed, the table, the shelves carved from the earth. He saw the pot of soup, the small stack of firewood, the mending in her lap. It was not a grave, it was a womb. He sank to the floor, his legs giving out, and began to shiver violently as the warmth began to penetrate his frozen layers. Alara said nothing. She ladled a bowl of hot soup and handed it to him. He took it with trembling hands, spilling some on himself, but he did not notice. He drank the soup, the warmth spreading through his chest, chasing away the deadly chill. He looked around the small, cave-like room, at the smooth clay walls that seemed to glow in the firelight, at the solid pillar of earth in the center, at the utter, unshakable stillness of the place. He looked at Alara, this woman they had all mocked and pitied, this mad woman. She had not been digging a grave, she had been building an ark. How? He finally managed to whisper, his voice hoarse. It was not just a question, it was a concession. It was an admission of his own profound ignorance. It was the sound of a world turned upside down. "The earth remembers the sun," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The storm raged for 2 more days. Silas stayed in the dugout, recovering his strength, his mind reeling with the implications of what he was witnessing. He was a man of practical knowledge, a man who understood the world through a set of established rules. Alara had not broken those rules. She had simply ignored them and followed a different, older set of laws. When the storm finally broke, leaving behind a world transformed, a world of dazzling white silence, Silas went home. He returned not just with a new understanding, but with a large pot of Alara's soup for his family. The story he told, first to his wife, then to his neighbors, spread through Haven's Rest faster than any rumor of madness had. It was a story of impossible survival, of a quiet, steady warmth in the heart of the blizzard's fury. It was a story that could not be dismissed. Silas was a respected man, not given to flights of fancy. His testimony was unshakable. When people began to emerge from their battered, frozen homes, to count the cost of the storm in dead livestock and damaged roofs, they looked toward the serpent riverbank with a new kind of wonder. The mole woman was gone. In her place was the riverbank woman, a figure of improbable wisdom and strength. Mr. Abernathy was among the hardest hit. Half the roof of his store had been torn away, and much of his stock was ruined by snow and ice. His pride was damaged even more than his property. He had pronounced judgment on Alara, had declared her methods to be folly, and his judgment had been proven catastrophically wrong. He never spoke to her again, but he no longer spoke against her either. His silence was its own form of capitulation. In the weeks that followed, a slow pilgrimage began. People came not to mock or to pity, but to learn. A young family whose cabin had been crushed by a fallen tree came first. They were destitute and desperate. Alara, without hesitation, showed them how to read the earth, how to choose a spot, how to begin the dig. She gave them her spare pickaxe, the one Silas had given her. Others followed. They came with questions, with offerings of food or tools, with a newfound humility. She taught them what she had learned: how to angle the entrance to trap the cold, how to build a hearth that drew properly, how to brace the walls with stone and timber. She was no longer an outcast. She had become a teacher, the keeper of a knowledge that had been proven in the crucible of the great storm. That spring, the dead riverbank came alive with activity. It was the site of a strange, hopeful construction boom, a community building not up, but down. The homes they built were more refined than Ilara's original dugout, incorporating the lessons she had taught and adding new innovations. They were warm in the winter and, as they would discover, cool in the summer. They were quiet, secure, and cheap to build and maintain. The sliver of worthless land became the most sought-after property in the region. They called the settlement the Warrens at first, but the name was later changed to the Sunken Hearth. Years passed. Ilara never left her dugout, though she expanded it, adding another room for storage and a small glassed-in atrium at the entrance where she could grow herbs year-round. She never married. She had found a different kind of partnership, a communion with the earth itself. She was the matriarch of the Sunken Hearth, a respected elder whose advice was sought on all matters. The children who had once pointed and whispered now came to her for stories, and she would tell them tales not of her own hardship, but of the generosity of the earth, of its long memory for sunlight, and of the wisdom in listening to the quiet truths that the loud, busy world so often ignores. Decades later, long after Ilara had passed, the community along the riverbank endured. The earth-sheltered homes had become a local architectural style, a testament to a single woman's refusal to accept the world's grim assessment of her chances. Her story became a foundational myth for the town, a lesson passed down from one generation to the next. It was a story about resilience, about the courage to look foolish, about the profound, untapped value that can be found in the places and people that have been discarded. It served as a permanent reminder that the most powerful innovations often come not from a desire to conquer nature, but from a humble willingness to learn from it. The world may build its monuments of stone and timber, reaching for the sky in acts of pride, but security, the story taught, is often found not in rising above, but in having the wisdom to go to ground.